So in the past 2 weeks, we have been doing transitivity analysis, right? And transitivity is a choice, right? It's a choice that you choose, is a grammatical pattern that you choose when you want to represent your experience in the world, right? Whether you see something, whether you think about something, whether you do something, whether you move, whether something is related to something. So you use different transitivity patterns in order to reflect reality, in order to reflect your experience, right? So in other words, language helps you encode. Language helps you encode. So help you encode your experience into different processes, right? Starting from material, verbal, mental, behavioral, relational, and existential. And each choice means different things, right? Now, last week, we looked at 2 different patterns, right? We have congruent patterns and versus incongruent patterns, right? So in congruent patterns, you usually have nominals, remember? These are like congruent patterns are basic patterns, right? Basic patterns that you acquire when you were kids, right? And in congruent patterns, like basic sentence patterns, you would have nominals, like nouns, okay? Noun groups as participants, right? Right? It could be participants could include an agent, the actor, could include the goal, could include the sayer, could include the censor, and so on. Typically, you would have nominals or noun groups as participants. And you will have verbs as the process, right? Right? To think, to do, to kill, to whatever, to move, right? Whatever. And then you would have adverbials and prepositional phrases as circumstances, right? So giving you extra information about when, about where, about why, about how, and so on. So you would have these 3 things doing different things in your transitivity patterns, okay? But, so that's congruent patterns. But in incongruent patterns, you would have, perhaps you have verbs, sometimes you have verbs as the participants, right, as entities. And sometimes you have circumstances or adverbials or prepositional phrases as participants and so on that we looked at last time. So these are incongruent patterns. And incongruent patterns are so hard to interpret or so hard to process because they are not what we expect in everyday use, right? So today we'll move on and we'll look at nominalization, okay? So that's what we'll do today, nominalization. But before that, just to remind you of what we did last time, I have these 5 sentences for you to unpack and change to congruent patterns. So on the handout, we'll do the first 5 items. 3. So you see the first 5 items on the handout, right? These are incongruent patterns or incongruous patterns, okay? And I want you to turn them into like more basic forms, more basic versions. Like in number 1, we had a long chat. This process to have, right, the verb to have, is according to our classification, it's the relational process, right? It's the relational process, right? To have or to be. So this is in the relational process. But if you look at a long chat here, okay, a more basic form might be we chatted for a long time, right? This is a more basic form because you have this as a participant and that's the same. But chat here is a process, right? Because it's a verb, right? And this is a verbal process too. And then for a long time, that's a prepositional phrase, so that's a circumstance, giving you extra information, right? So this is a more basic or more what we would expect, okay? Whereas this is in a different process and it means the same thing, but had here doesn't really have the meaning of possession, right? We had a long chat. It's not like I have a car or we have a car. So had here has some kind of non-verbal meaning, right? And the meaning is different. Like we had a run, we had a swim. Had there doesn't indicate possession. So as you can see, when you change it to this kind of incongruous sentence pattern, the verb here, the main verb, the main process is not like basic. It doesn't have like the basic meaning that we would expect. But chat here has a clear basic meaning. Okay? In number 2, I'll show you just the first and the second, and I'll have you do 3, 4, and 5. Bombing continued throughout the night. You have bombing here, right? And bombing here is a nominal, right? Is a noun. But as you can see, bombing itself cannot continue, right? Bombing by itself cannot continue. Somebody must be doing the bombing, right? So this is not the basic pattern. So the basic pattern might be someone did something, right? So you can say something like X continue to bomb Y. Could be a city, could be a person. X, a person, continue to bomb Y, could be a city, right? Throughout the night. And this is a more basic pattern because you have continue to bomb as a verbal, right? And that's a process with X as the participant, right? And Y as the goal, and so on. Or you could say Y continue to be bombed throughout the night without even have to mention the X. Okay? And you can see that in the incongruent pattern here, bombing has become, I don't know, an actor, right? Continue, right? Or an agent, which by itself cannot, right? In reality. But here, since after we unpack the sentence pattern, we have a real participant, a person that can do that. Okay? So I'll give you about maybe 5 minutes to do 3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5 are longer than 1 and 2, but the technique is the same thing. So you have to look at what's so not common about 3, 4, and 5. Like Canada. Canada saw. The verb to see, how could a country see something, right? See is a mental process. A mental process belongs to like living things, right? Living beings, right? So Canada cannot really see, right? So can you unpack that and can you make it more basic, right? Maybe it has to be just extra information, right? Or a circumstance, right? Canada rather than just a participant. It's like Canada is a sensor, which in fact it cannot, right? So can you unpack that and have a more basic version of that? So I'll walk around to help you if you need help. So just let me know. Okay, I'll give you maybe 5 minutes. There's no one correct version, but you have to unpack like incongruous things like Canada and then maybe the launch. So number 3, in number 3, you see Canada. In this pattern is a mental process, right? To see, but in fact, Canada is not a living being, so it cannot really see. So a more basic version would be Canada as a circumstance, right? Because it's a place, right? So we can say in Canada, right? In Canada, that's a prepositional phrase as a circumstance, right? Saw the launch of 50-day election campaign last weekend. You can say if a 50-day election campaign was launched last weekend. And here it has become a material process, right? With was launched as the material process, right? The verb, right? And the reason why I use the passive voice here is because I don't need to mention who launched the election process. Okay? But you can say X launched a 50-day election campaign last weekend in Canada. You can say that. But you don't need to. Okay? Or in Canada, X launched. X could be anyone. Launched a 50-day election campaign last weekend. Same thing. But the reason I use the passive voice is because I don't know who X was, and there's no reason to mention him or her or them. Okay, so far so good. Now, going to number 4, you have his obvious intelligence and exceptional oratory. Oratory is like speaking skills, okay, speaking skill. Speaking skills in public too, public speaking skills. So his obvious intelligence and exceptional oratory won him. So you see won, this is kind of a material process, right? Process of doing, right? And it's causative to cause him to win, right? So that's causative. So in this case, they are not the typical actors that we would think, right? Because they cannot really act. They cannot really cause somebody to act, right? Somebody to win. So we need to kind of unpack the meaning. So we could turn these into like maybe attributes or qualities of a person, right? So you can say something like, who is this guy? He was, what is it? Obviously intelligent and had exceptional oratory, like that, right? So he, whoever that was obviously intelligent. So this is a relational process, which is typical when you want to describe someone, right? He was X or Y, right? And had exceptional oratory. Then he became a cabinet minister. I'm sorry. He became a minister without portfolio in, what's the name? Conrad's 1951's cabinet. So in this version, I use the relational processes for both clauses, right? And you can see that the difference between the more basic and the incongruous pattern is that in the incongruous pattern, you can see a very long sentence, right? Because you combine and you condense everything into like different noun phrases, and so the meaning is dense and the sentence is very long. But when you unpack the meaning, you can break it down into like 2 sentences. Okay? Or you can't, if you want to combine them, you can't do it like this. Because he was obviously intelligent and had exceptional oratory skills, he became a minister without portfolio in Conrad's 1951's cabinet. Okay. A minister without portfolio means a person, a minister, maybe to whom no department, no specific department is assigned. Okay. So he doesn't have the real title, the real department to work for. Okay. But he still works for the government. But there's no specific department that's assigned to him. In number 5, okay, so far so good. In number 5, you have the release came after, right? So this is like a material process with release as if it were a participant, a human participant, right? It can come, right? But in fact, it cannot. So the release came after rising expectations that Professor Stein would be freed, right? So in this case, you could just unpack this part, right? The release came. So you can say something like, if you don't know who, right? You can say X was released. Okay. After people in Washington expected throughout the day that and then the rest. So you have here and you have here. Right? X was released after people in Washington expected throughout the day that Professor Stein, age 48, would be the hostage to be freed. Right? The difference between the two versions is, in this version, it's like as if the release was a human participant that can come, right? Whereas in this version, it's a material process, right? And release is really a material process, right? Basically speaking, right? And after people in Washington expected throughout the day. So in this case, expected is the mental process, right? But here, expectation here is like there is not even a process, not even something going on. It's just a noun, right? But here is a mental process, okay, of people. Okay. So I think by doing this, you can see clearly the relationship between different choices in transitivity, right? Transitivity is choosing from so many different choices, right? And I'm not saying that these are wrong, but I'm saying that these are incongruent patterns, patterns that you don't really expect, but they exist in the real world, especially in writing. And this is what makes English difficult, right, for non-native speakers, I think, because the meaning is packed in like a long sentence. Okay. Now, what I want to do next is to tie this issue, the congruous and incongruous patterns, to tie the issue to what we call nominalization. Okay. So in many cases of incongruous patterns, you see what we call nominalization. Okay? For example, in number 5, the release. You see, from the material process or the verb to release, and then you have the release in number 5. Okay? The release there is a noun, and we call that nominalization, the process of making something into a noun. And so we'll study nominalization today. Okay? So what is nominalization? Nominalization, you have nominal, which is noun, right? I is to make, and Asian, that's a noun suffix, right? So the process in which a noun is created from words that are not nouns originally. So that's what we call nominalization. In English, you can create nominal forms using so many suffixes, right? Tion, sion, or ing. You add these to a verb, right? Depending on what verb you have, right? Sometimes you can add tion, sometimes sion. Especially for SION, you add to verbs that end with D. So erode, for example, you add erosion, SION, like that, right? Conclude, conclusion, right? So conclude, conclusion. So when it ends with a D, you add SION, but it's pronounced as this consonant, the fricative voice. And in other cases, you add TION or ING, okay? Or other suffixes, including a zero suffix, meaning you don't add anything, you just switch from that word to be a verb, right? Except plus ends, acceptant, king plus dom, or bore plus dom, boredom. So this is morphology, right? So you can add different things, right? Or you can just maybe, which one is that? Change and change. You just don't have to add anything, zero suffix, okay? So that's normalization. There are so many ways, so that's morphology, not the concern of this class. And in Korean, you could do almost the same thing, right? Verb stem plus gi, or verb stem plus nungot, right? Or right? So you can see all these ilta, ilgi, and so on, right? Hada, hanungot shi, hanungot sul, and so on, right? And moida, like mo right? And so on. And when you turn them into a noun, they work like noun, and you have like these suffixes that indicate whether they are subject or object, and so on, right? So all languages work almost the same way. So that's normalization. And you know that the material process is a process of doing or happening, right? And typically we'll have an agent or doer who brings out a consequence on the goal, right? The American bombers killed the civilian. That's clearly the material process, right? And you could use the passive voice, but still in the material process to background the agent. So you can have this in the back, by, with the by phrase, right? But normalization can do further than that, right? So that's why we're talking about normalization today. In these two versions, you have student fees have been increased by 400%, right? So in this case, it's still the material process, right? Have been increased. You have the verb to increase as the material process. And we have increased fees by 400%. That's still the material process. But people who are behind the increasing of the fees might prefer the passive version because they don't want to indicate that they are the ones who are doing that action, okay? But when you have the normalization, you could even further background the agent or the responsibility, right? We have three versions here. The first two versions you have already seen today, right? Material process in the passive voice. But in this one, the killing of civilians, that's from the verb, right? And you add the ing here. So it has become a noun phrase, right? And in this case, you don't really see who the bombers are, right? Like the American or British or whoever, you don't really see. And the sense of time, like were killed, is lost, okay? It's lost. The sense of time, whether it's the past, whether it's the future, is lost. So that's normalization. So normalization can even further background the people and the responsibility and the cause, okay? So we are looking at normalizations today. And there's no specification of who or what is changing, and only the effects are foregrounded, what happened, right? And normalization can background questions of agency and causality, who caused what to happen, okay? And who or what causes the change, okay? Let's talk about the effects of normalization. As I said, people are removed, right? The agent is removed, and therefore responsibility for the action has been removed as well. And this makes it seem as though the events just happened. If you compare each set, you will see that the agent and the responsibility is lost. The student lost his paper and was rather upset. In this case, it's clear that the cause of the paper loss is the student, right? But in the B version, in the other version, the student was upset about the loss of his paper. Now it's not clear who lost the paper, so the agent is removed. So this one is good if you want to use it to avoid speaking about or avoid focusing on or avoid highlighting on the fact that you lost the paper. I'm sorry I have failed to return my library book on time. I'm sorry about the failure to return my library book on time. In the B version, the failure here is a normalized version, right? And it just doesn't talk about who failed to return the book personally. So this is a good way to avoid responsibility if you compare that to the first one. And the last one, monitoring and analysis has shown that contamination is at such a low level that it poses no threat to health. So we are not told as to who did the monitoring and who did the analysis, right? And when you do it this way, it seems like there is an independent unit, there's an independent department that did that, right? But in fact, it might be the nuclear power plant that did the monitoring itself and did the analysis itself, which is not very trustworthy, right? So when you see this kind of normalization, you have to ask who did that, right? And whether that person, that organization has some kind of vested interest, whether that person has any kind of vested interest, or whether that person will get some kind of benefits from doing that, right? Because if they get some benefits from doing that, they may not want people to know, right? So, normalization is a good strategy for them to hide the agency. Okay. And some genres of writing, genres here referring to different kinds of writing, right? When you write for newspapers, it's a different way of writing. When you write for magazines, it's a different way of writing, right? When you write papers in class, it's a different way of writing. So that's what we call genre of writing. So some genres of writing prefer the removal of agents and prefer the passive voice, such as in scientific writing and academic writing, right? Because without people, the tone is more objective, right? Analysis of statistics has been shown to review, and versus we analyze the statistics. So in academic writing, it's preferred to use the first version rather than the second version because it doesn't matter who does the analysis, right? They should get the same results if the analysis is good, okay, is correctly done. So it doesn't matter whether it's we or them or anyone. So that's why normalization is preferred in some genres of writing, okay? And it sounds more objective too, okay? And normalization can change, can alter our vision of the agent and the cause. So if you see this version, a demonstration against increased tuition fees took place in front of the main building, caused disruptions to class. Here, you just think of it as a demonstration, right? But actually, it's a process, right? It's a verb that has been turned into a noun, right? And if you change it to students demonstrating, okay? Students demonstrating against the increased fee. The impression might be different, right? Because if you just see the demonstration, oh, it might be political demonstration, it could be other people. But if we see the real agent, who might be students, right? And they decided to disrupt, to not go to the classes, right? In order to protest against the tuition fee increase. So in this case, you might feel sympathy towards the students. But in this case, the demonstration without the agent, you don't feel that kind of sympathy, not the same thing, right? So same. And then here, the strike has now prevented workers from entering the plant for over a week. So you might be thinking, who might be the people on strike, right? What if it's the real workers, all the workers that were on strike, and people who were in the building were only the management. So that would feel different, right? Because it's the workers who join together in order to be on strike. Okay? So that gives you a different impression. And nominalization can remove any sense of time, because when you make a verb into a noun, the tense is gone, right? So you don't know when the event happened. Like in this case, the Prime Minister rejected a call to carry out an inquiry into allegations of corruption. So what I underlined here are all nominalized phrases. He announced that the tightening of sanctions was a decision that has been made through all the legal channels. So you have to ask the question, when did someone call? Or was the call real, even real? When were allegations made or sanctions tightened? When was the decision made through legal channels? Because when you have nominalized phrases, you don't know the time, right? Because they are no longer verbs. Okay? You have no tense. Okay? And since actions can become a thing, it can be counted, described, or classified or qualified using adjectives. And this means that causality is of secondary concern, meaning you don't talk about the cause, you only focus on the effect. So like here, the regretful failure to return my library books on time, you can modify failure from fail, right, from the verb fail, with this adjective and treating it like a thing, showing apology. But you are, the person who says this is still sidestepping, evading, sidestep or evading the question of who should be responsible for it, indicating who might be the agent behind it, right? So the person is sidestepping the responsibility still. Decisive and precise strikes on enemy positions have been successful. Again, here, strikes, from the verb to strike, you can modify it, treating it as if it's a thing. Okay? Extensive disruption, same thing. You can modify all the nominalized phrases with adjectives. Okay? Hanyang University is a dynamic, fast-growing, forward-looking institution, right? So instead of saying that it looks forward to something, right, you have this as a kind of a modifier rather than the verb, right, to look forward to. Okay? And normalizations can become a fossilized common usage that you no longer think that it used to be a process. Like when you talk about globalization, people think of globalization as a noun, right? We don't really use globalize as a verb, when in fact it used to be a verb, to globalize, right? And we usually think of it as the noun, globalization, and we just use it like that without even thinking that it's a process, it's a verb. And it's a process of political or cultural decisions, right, involving so many cultural or political decisions. So, but here, you're treating it as a thing, right? So it has become what we call the fossilized common phrase that people use without even thinking that it's a process rather than a thing. Okay? And finally, when you make something into a nominalized version, it has become more abstract. Okay? And when it's abstract, the agency and what's not being done or what is being done is glossed over. Okay? So, for example, our primary role is to deliver our mission and to be a strategic driver of economic development. To deliver our mission, what does it mean to deliver the mission, right? So, to plus a verb is another way of nominalization. Okay? Or to improve the health of people by pursuing excellence in healthcare. Pursuing excellence, what does it mean to pursue excellence, right? What actually is being done. So when you normalize things, things have become abstract, okay? This is from Hanyang University's website that we already looked at, right? So make the world a warmer and better place. What does it mean to make the world a warmer place, right? What does it mean? It's so abstract, right? The dreams of our world. So people dream of doing something, but actually, what are those dreams? Are we told as to what dreams they are? No, right? And the dreams will blossom and bear the wonderful fruits, right? So we are not told as to what those dreams are and how they would be realized into reality and so on. Okay? So before we do exercise, let's turn this into the passive voice and the normalized version. Can you do it? So the passive voice is easy, right? So the staff constructed the course with the aim of generating maximum income. So you just have to switch the position, right? So the course was constructed by the staff with the aim of generating maximum income, right? So that's the passive voice version. So we have the course was constructed and then by the staff, which you can leave it out depending on whether you want to have that in there or not, and with the aim of generating income, maximum income. If I leave this out, it's good in one way, right? In a sense, because maybe I don't want to indicate who constructed the courses, right? It might be, in some universities, it might be the management, it might be the president that constructed the courses of what you need to take rather than your professors, right? In some places, it's like that. So they may not want to indicate who constructed the course. Okay? And for the nominalization, you can do, so construct, right? This is a verb, so you turn it into a noun. In this case, you just add tion, right? So the construction of the course was done with the aim to increase maximum income, whatever, and so on. So in this case, you cannot even indicate, by who, right? So that one makes it look more objective and makes it look like they hope for the best, right? They designed the course to generate maximum income and so on. Okay. Now, what we want to do next is to turn to the handout that I gave out earlier today. And we'll look at news and news headlines. Okay? And we'll look at how news agencies throughout the world prefer to use normalized versions of one case in particular. That's the case of fear, concern, and worry. You all have heard about the 9/11 event, right? That happened back in perhaps 1999, I think. And that event caused a huge loss of life and property, right, throughout the world. And it has a magnitude of effects, right, on people's life. So that event, even though it has passed, right, that event still caused maybe fear, concern, and worries among people that terrorism will happen again, right? And every year, there's a kind of an commemoration or anniversary of that event throughout the world, right? The 9/11 event. And news agencies around the world try to cover that particular commemorative event every year. So we'll look at how they use the word fear, concern, and worry when they describe the anniversary, the 9/11 anniversary, every year. Okay, so these have been selected. The headlines and the news have been selected from different sources: CNN, BBC, or CNB, and so on, NBC, and so on, or Reuters. And we want to look at how they use the word fear, concern, and worry when they describe the anniversary of 1911. But if we look at these three things, okay, three nouns, they are actually from three processes, right? And they are mental processes, right? So when you think about fear, I fear something, right? I fear X. So I is the sensor, right? And then X is, I don't know, phenomenon, the things that I fear, right? Concern and worry work in the same way. Okay, so they are all mental processes. But here, they sometimes, and most of the times, they are used as nominals. They have been nominalized. So we'll see what these guys, when they are nominalized, they have become participants, right? What these guys can do on people's life and how they can affect people's life. Okay, so can you circle? Can you find nominalized fear, concern, and worry in these headlines and news pieces? Okay, there are about maybe 9 or 10. 10. There are about 10 passages or so, or 10 lines or so, 10 paragraphs or so. Can you circle and look at and label how fear, concern, and worry have been used as nouns? Okay, whether they are actors, whether they are censors, and so on. Okay, in number 1, let me show you. In number 1, I should bring up that handout online here. So here, in number 1, poll shows Americans fear more attacks. In this case, it's just a straightforward case, right? Because you have fear as the verb, it's a mental process with American people as the censor, and then more attacks as the phenomenon. So that's straightforward. In this case, it's straightforward. It's not nominalized, okay? It's just a verb. But it's interesting that it's cast as a result of poll, right? Poll shows, right? It's interesting because, you know, mental processes, fear, concern, and worry, mental processes are personal experience, okay? When you fear something, it's personal. Other people cannot know that you fear, right? Unless you show it, like, unless you shiver or unless you quiver like that, right? Unless you are in a panic situation, you can show your reaction to fear. But if you just fear, or if you just feel worry, how could people know? Unless you show it through your face. But here, it's like, you know, you can show it through statistics and so on, right? So it's kind of interesting that how could personal experiences be known by measuring using numbers and so on, right? So it's interesting. They just do it this way in order to objectify, to make it more objective that people really fear the attack and so on, okay? So when you say poll shows, that's more objective, right? Because they have numbers, right? Poll has to do with numbers and so on. So can you do numbers 2, 3 to 10 and try to look at how the word fear, worry, or concern and concern are used? In this case, you know, fear here, and then is it an agent? Is it a thing? Is it a participant? What type of participant is it, and so on? Okay. Okay. Before we proceed, there is a question about the format or the form of newspapers' headlines. Okay. When you see ED, we are talking about newspaper headlines. Okay. Only headlines. Okay. When you see the ED in newspaper headlines, that means passive voice. Okay? Flight in number 6, for example, British Airways flight, whatever, delayed. Right? You see the ED, there's like was delayed. But in headlines, you need it to be short, right? You need the headlines to be short. So they leave out the B. You only have the past participle form, ED. Okay? Or bombed, whatever, okay? Was bombed. So you see the ED. Or past participle, so that's passive voice, okay? And when you see this infinitive verb in a headline, after security concerns stop the service, the infinitive usually refers to past tense verb. So it's like stopped the service, like that, in reality. But in headlines, because the ed is already used for the passive voice, you need to use the infinitive form for the past tense events, okay? And what about the future event? You use to plus infinitive. Let's say airline to continue the service. This is not on the handout, but to continue, that's like the airlines will continue the service. In headlines, okay? We are talking about headlines only. So because in headlines, you need to be short, you need to be concise. So ed is for the passive voice, the infinitive is for the past tense, and to infinitive is for future events. And so let's look at number 2. Let me switch back to number 2. Number 2, and we can talk about number 2 and number 3 together. But the police chief in charge of securing the northern city said his biggest fear was a terrorist attack. And number 3, the bombs are our biggest fear. So you see two nominalized versions, right, of fear in relational processes, right? Because you have the be verb was, and then you have the be verb here are. So relational process. But it's interesting to note that now fear, when it has become a noun, when it has been nominalized, you can modify it with anything, right? We talked about the fact that when it has become a noun, you can modify it with adjectives. Like here, his biggest fear. And this one, the bombs are our biggest fear. So now fear has become something, has become a thing that has sizes, right? It can be small, it can be big, right? If you use it as a verb, you can say, I fear it very much or whatever. I immensely fear it, and so on. But when it has become a thing, you can just indicate the size, like biggest or smallest, whatever, right? So it's interesting that fear, when it has become a noun, a nominalized form, it can have size, right? And it's like a thing now rather than a feeling, right? Because only things have size, right? But in these two instances, you can indicate whose fear, you can tell whose fear it is. Like his biggest fear, there's his. So you can say that it's the police fear, right? And in this case, our biggest fear, our, meaning people in Baghdad, for example. So in this case, the agent, the sensor, the sensors might be easy to retrieve, might be easy to guess, okay? And yet, fear has become a thing now, right? And it has size too, okay? Because noun can have adjectives, right? Number 4, you have so many nominalized versions, nominalized versions of processes, right? Any indication, so something indicated, right? The bombing here, someone bombed something, right? But we'll focus on the word fear right now, okay? So you have Stokes' renewed fears about the sophistication of international terrorism. Stokes here means to cause fire, to cause fire, to cause fire. Okay, to build a fire, to stoke, to cause a fire, to build a fire. Okay, so this is the verb, right? The subject is any indication, stoked, renewed fear. Again, when it has become a noun, you can modify it with any adjective. Now you modify it with renew. So the fears have been renewed. I don't know by who, but we are not told because it's noun right now, right? So fears that have been renewed, have been made new again, right? About the sophistication of terrorism and intensify the fallout. So any indication can intensify the fallout. So in this case, if we talk about indication, something indicates something, right? So indication can stoke, can cause fire to fear, and can intensify the fallout. So when you make it into a noun, it has power that can do things in the material process. And if we focus on fear here, whose fears are these? Stoke renewed fears. Whose fears? Are we told? No. And we are not told because it's nominalized, and the agent is gone, right? And why do they fear that? We don't know, because the cause is gone when you nominalize a verb, right? And if you look at the context, fear intensify the fallout on global markets, right? Global market. So it has to do with stocks trading, maybe stock trading, with investment. So fears here could be fears that investors, people who invest in the stock market, for example, could be fears of the investors. Or it could be fear of people in general, but we don't know, and that's not even clear, right? So fear here seems to be like a more powerful agent rather than like clear mental process of people, right? Number 5. So the agent is gone, the cause is gone. We don't know whose fears are those, right? Maybe only the investors, right? Europe's biggest airline, British Airways, canceled a London-Washington flight as security fears grounded a US-bound plane for 7th time in just over a week. Now, fear, again, has been nominalized, and now it has even more power than it usually is. Fears are just your personal experience. Now what it can do is to ground the plane, right? How could fears ground the plane? Can you think about that? It has to be people who grounded the plane, right? But here it's like fears are agents that grounded the plane, right? So fear here when it has become nominalized, it has power. It's a powerful agent. It's a powerful actor that can even ground the plane. But in fact, it could be authorities that grounded the plane, right? And whose fears are these? The authorities, the government, people in general, passenger, we don't know. But we just know that they are fears, and fears could ground the plane, right? In number 6, same thing. Security concerns stop service. So stop, like past tense, right? So concerns can stop service, but in fact it cannot, right? Only people can, right? And whose concerns are these? We don't know. Maybe concerns of the authorities, concerns of people in general, who knows? We are not told, right? Because it's gone after the nominalization, okay? Number 7, Tokyo stocks closed lower with tech stocks, stocks about technology, hit by concerns that security worries would hurt leading economies and so on. Tech stock hit by concern. Hit is a material process. Concerns here is in the by position, preposition phrase, so it's like the actor, right? So concerns here is like concerns can hit stock. It's like concern our agent, right, that can hit, but actually it cannot, right? But again, when it has become nominalized, it has power, right? That security worries would hurt. So worries could hurt people now, right? Or could hurt the economies. In this case, worries are actor that can hurt people, right, in the material process, okay? In 8, what do we have here? Despite concerns about the upcoming anniversary of the terrorist attack, in this case, it's, again, a nominalized version of concern, but we are not told. My point is we are not told as to whose concerns are these, right? Maybe investors' concern or people in general's concerns. We are not told. And it's never clear in the context. Number 9 and number 10, what do we have? The world went on terror alert Wednesday as memories attack last year intensify fears. So you can see memories could intensify fears, okay? So memories, again, personal experiences can intensify fears, can cause things to happen, okay? And then, what do we have? Jitters about new terrorist attacks also translated into stricter security at airports. This is a very incongruent sentence pattern. Jitter has come from the verb to jitter, right? To jitter is to be nervous, right? So people can jitter, right? So people can become nervous, right? So to become nervous also translated into is like, I don't know, material process, and jitters could be the actor right now. But jitter itself is to become nervous, right? Into stricter security at airport, government and private offices, and so on. So you can see a lot of normalizations here, including fear and jitters and maybe memories. Right? Memorize, right? That's the verb. And number 10, fears mingle with prayers. Fears like, this is a behavioral process. This is the behavior. Mingle is to combine, to mix with, and so on. So fear is like a living thing that can combine with prayers, and so on. Okay? The number 10, churches offer prayers and choir. This is pronounced choir, right? Not chore. Choir sang requiems. Requiems are like sad songs for dead people. As a wave of memorial ceremonies for September 11, dead wave swept around the world amid fears of further violence. Okay? So fear here is in the circumstantial, so it's not actor in this case, but it's like removed from the censor. So who feared? And so on. You can ask that question. But concern, intruded, the verb is intruded. So, but concern about Washington's international role, intruded. So concern here is a normalized phrase as well, and then it can intrude, so it can go into, right? So, which in fact it cannot. So again, it has become something powerful, okay? So all in all, what can you see from these headlines? That fear, concern, and worry have become powerful agents, right? That can do things in the material process, right? Most of the time, right? It could shut down the airport, it could ground the plane, it could hit the stock market, and so on, when in fact it cannot, right? And so because when you normalize these verbs, these personal experiences, they have become things that they, so that they have sizes, they could act on people, okay? And is this a good way to talk about fear? Maybe, right? Because when people read news about this, right, they fear more, even though they don't have personal experience on these events themselves. So they fear because they just see the word fear, right? And fear can do things. Fears are so powerful, right? And but in the end, as readers, can we do anything? No, because when they ground the airport, it's the security officers, it's the authorities that do that, right? So we still, as readers, we are left, if we don't take these lines carefully, right? We are left with the feeling of fear and worry and concerns. So you have to ask question, whose fears are these? And should we fear, right? Just like when there are news about people in North Korea or North Korean leader trying to bomb or trying to pose some threats, the whole world goes crazy about the threat, right? But people in South Korea, they just live their normal life as usual, right? So when my parents, for example, read the news or heard the news on TV, they ask me, they call me, or friends call me, are you ready to leave? And so on, right? So this kind of reporting causes fear, right? This kind of reporting causes fear to people, right? But people who don't have the experience or who don't care, who don't read this, they don't fear, right? And so this is not a very good way to empower people, right? But maybe people have kind of relinquished their freedom, give away their freedom because they feel fear. So everything is left to the authorities to deal with the issues, right? They can close the airport, they could impose more strict measure of security and so on, including strip you at the airport and so on, right? So when you read things like this, just be careful, okay? So we'll come back and look at metaphors, the issue of metaphors, which is related to normalization here on Thursday, okay?